Hello and welcome to UPSC Preparation Simplified, an initiative by Rao's IS Study Circle where we try to address the problems that you aspirants might be facing while preparing for the examination. Now today we are going to talk about a very important topic, the topic for which less information is available, and this topic deals with understanding of case studies, and we are going to use it in terms of a context as well. We are going to use the context of UPSC Mains 2021 in order to understand how case studies are structured, what is the meaning and significance, and how you can do better as well. In this context, the person who will be guiding us in this entire journey will be Mr. Vikram Kaushal, who is an accomplished author. He teaches ethics, integrity and aptitude at Rao's IS Study Circle, and he has guided thousands of students in terms of civil service examination. So sir, welcome again. So sir, when we talk about ethics, integrity, aptitude, this is the part 2 of the video. We are now focusing on case studies. The case studies, when we talk about, this is actually something which is very unique as well in terms of nature. So why UPSC has actually chosen to put case studies in the GS paper 4? What is the logic behind it?
Absolutely. So UPSC has this a lot of stream of aspirants that it selects every year, and then they kind of get tested in the field. What we now want to do is we want to add another stage where we are able to simulate, artificially create environments, at least cognitively, at least in thought, which look more or less similar to the kind of situations that the aspirants are going to face really on the ground in the real world. And by looking at how they're going to respond, although obviously in the real time that may be different, but at least in a simulation, we are going to get somewhat of a near real-time idea of how good these aspirants are going to be in being able to deal with it. And that's what the UPSC is trying to get at through these case studies.
Wonderful. So now when we talk about the case studies are something which actually pose different kind of challenges in terms of understanding. So let's try to solve one problem at a time. Now when we approach a case study, what are the things on which we should pay attention to in the first aspect of reading itself?
Absolutely, sir. Now when we look at a case study, like I would like to draw the analogy of a subjective type question, an essay type question. We usually look at the first thing is the directive words, and then the limiting phrases, and then the content words. Similarly, when we look at a case study, the first things we usually look at is how is it defined? What? Who are you? What that means is, what is your position? What is your designation? And what is your mandate? And this is important to understand in a case study, as the examiner puts across different patterns in different case studies, where somewhere it is defined as to who are you, and some places it is ambiguous or left undefined. And that has a significant impact on not only how we are going to be taking our perspectives, whether we are going to be writing the answer in first person or third person, but also how we are going to do our merit and demerit analysis and what will be our line of action. So these are some of the first things to look at. Now, for example, when in a case study, if it is defined that you are a station house officer and maybe you are to conduct a public drive in the district, the case study eventually points out that these are the steps that are to be taken in the district. An aspirant has to identify early on that the station house officer may not have the authority, does not have the authority over the whole district, that it has to go through the channelization of the office of the superintendent of police. And thereby, the manner in which it is going to be written, the suggestions are going to be altered. So that part is essentially an understanding what your authority or designation is. Also, let's just say that it is written that you are to submit a report to the Ministry of Environment. But the question, let's just say dealing with land acquisition, also says that the previous rehabilitation in the area was not done properly. Sometimes an aspirant tends to over-exceed one's mandate by writing that I am going to be directing the administration in the line of doing a better exercise with the rehabilitation which was possibly not rightly done. But that would then be the domain of possibly the state government and maybe the district commissioner or the divisional commissioner or whatever, depending upon the kind of land acquisition we're dealing with and the area we're dealing with. And you may possibly be appointed by the Ministry of Environment and Forests to write a report, which you would have to look at with what exactly is your authority, where it is being derived from. So these are some of the elementary things that at the start of a case study, one has to look for before one even starts to write the case study or comprehend the answer.
Wonderfully said, sir. Now, one thing which actually was posed by one of a student of ours, he clearly mentioned that, sir, there is a role that we expect, and there are nitty-gritties of role as well. For example, there is an expectation from a role of an SHO, maybe deputy commissioner, and then say higher up in the hierarchy. And we all, when we are aspirants, we are not trained for that, about the kind of role that we can actually perform. So in such a scenario, what is the right way to address this kind of a, this is a more of a mental, where we are not very clear in which direction we should move. So what is your suggestion to handle this?
Well, I would say definitely we are not lawyers, most of us, the people appearing for civil service aspirants, and we're not already serving civil servants.
Of course.
So we're not very accurately aware to the dots as to how the administrative hierarchy runs. With regards to the generic hierarchical orders and a basic understanding of, for example, how it would run in the district or in the police force, it is pertinent that we put in some effort to understand those hierarchies as part of the academic exercise of the syllabus. But beyond a reasonable extent, we could simply and generally use terms such as I would refer to my superiors, or I am going to direct to my inferiors, right? Or sorry, my subordinates. In the sense, I would like to say that some of these case studies in a repeat theme say that you are an executive engineer or you are a project manager. So on a issue of creation of a bridge which was found to be faulty. Now this is the repeat theme that we've had 2 times over in nearly the same case study. And what are you going to do? So for example, if you're going to take the action of firing the junior engineer, when it is mentioned specifically that you're the executive engineer and that junior engineers have maybe been reporting wrongly, or maybe it's a case of dereliction of duty or something else, maybe of lack of competency. As such, you would clearly see that the executive engineer is senior to the junior engineers and you have the power to specifically fire them. Now it is clear from the language of the case study itself that they are junior to you and you have the authority. On the other hand, when you're a project manager and you're to be promoted to an additional chief engineer, which is a 2021 case study, again dealing with a bridge, right? Exactly what line of action would you have to take, especially if you have to cancel the contract and maybe get a new contractor on board? The process could be long and have a lot of its own particularities. So in that case, you could simply write that I would go through the appropriate channel of my superiors and different departments in order to get that done. So we could summarily take this overarching approach in writing such manner.
So sir, you have defined this role as well, that we have to be rational and reasonable, and that is something which is very important. Apart from that, there are few values of being a civil servant: accountable, transparent, at the same time communicating to your subordinates as well. These values should be highlighted in that sense, and this is how you normally do that. So this is something which is very understandable. Now let's move to the case study part per se. So when we go through the case, one of the challenges that students normally feel is that how to define various scenarios. So what is the right approach to define scenarios? Can you help us in understanding them by taking some examples itself?
Absolutely, sir. Now, when we read the case study, one of the first challenges that we have in front of us is, after looking at what is the particular question that has been asked, now that UPSC can actually ask different kinds of question sets from us. So the UPSC could have asked, highlight the merits or demerits. What are the options? Maybe construct the options and highlight their merits and demerits. Or what is the ethical justification for something? How do you justify? Or what is going to be your line of action, procedure and justification? So first of all, we would have to look at that before we obviously create our options. And then the second thing that we would want to look at is identify exactly what is the central ethical proposition. Meaning, we should be able to de-alienate, is it really just a moral temptation? A difficult decision, but it's essentially a choice between right and wrong. And doing the right thing seems pretty difficult, but it's actually just a moral temptation. Or it is really an ethical dilemma. That means that it is a choice between right and right. So a choice between loyalty and honesty, between short-term benefits and long-term benefits. So one would be able to, underline and underscore what the real issue is. Now, once one has done that, what we require subsequently is to be able to highlight the stakeholders, especially for our own selves, as to who are the people who are going to get impacted in the impact analysis, but also who are the people involved in the decision making exercise. So who all need to be taken in trust? What is the process and channelization? Because there is also hierarchical accountability for an administrator. There is also procedural accountability element for an administrator. So who all do we need to take on board before we take a decision, and how this is going to go around? So that part is an essential part before creating the scenarios. Getting this clarified to our own selves. And once we've done that, then we can actually get to articulating and writing down those choices.
Okay.
Now, in the case that the case study says that what are the options available to you, so that the case study has not pointed out what the options are, which we are to evaluate, rather we are to do that. In that case, I would recommend that we create the options in the order of least correct to most correct. For if we write the converse way around, then it kind of doesn't make any sense to write subsequent options after writing the best option already. And we should also not go for something which is blatantly wrong, patently immoral, because the examiner should not tend to think that we think this is an option on the table. Now, while creating and writing down those options, we have to be specific. What I mean by that is, rather than writing that I am going to work on women empowerment in a question, one would rather write that I am going to take this course of creating skill-based options through XYZ program. I'm going to take specific initiatives through the community block office, through maybe the DAY NRLM scheme existing, and so on and so forth. Right. That obviously more detailed scope could be in the final course of action, but one has to be specific in what one writes. And apart from that, once one is writing it, one has to be aware to a significant degree of the specific ethical articulation of the terminology. And what I mean by that is, because there are significant differences of meanings between the words like pity or sympathy or empathy or compassion, one has to be very specific while using these terms, for these are content words in our paper. And thereby, while writing the options, one has to make sure of that.
Okay.
Now that's one aspect to how one would write or create these options. I would like to come to the second and third aspect as well, as to how to create these scenarios. So, well, this second part relates with what I would like to say is procedural correctness. Now, when I say procedural correctness, what I do mean to say is that one has to have a basic awareness of what are fundamental procedures, including law. To give an example of what that means is, now, one of these cases that we had was a case of sexual harassment, where it was mentioned that you are the executive director of this private MNC IT company, and that there has been this instance of sexual harassment, which is a repeat instance, and that Mr. A, who is the alleged culprit, sexual harasser, has been harassing Mrs. X. And when it comes to your notice, what are you going to be doing? Well, we need to realize, which can only come from the understanding of what actually provisions of POSH are, that is the Protection of Women from Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act 2013, that in fact the employer, which clearly is covered as you in this case being the executive director, that the employer has a lot of duties that have to be performed preemptively before any act happens. And it so appears through reading the case study that those duties have not been performed. As such, once one realizes that, which can only be realized through actually the understanding of some basic legal procedures here, one would start writing the answer by saying that these XYZ steps are what am I going to do towards me. This is what these steps I'm going to do to hold myself accountable. And then subsequently get to how I'm going to deal with that case. And then to the end point, get to what is going to be the structural resolution for the future. Now, answering like this is going to ensure, first of all, one, procedural correctness, but also in the second part, it is going to exhibit integrity. What we mean to say is by that we are first of all going to uphold ourselves to those standards that we are going to be upholding to others. And that has to be shown also through the sequential order of writing of our choices or case scenarios. And that does require the understanding of procedural correctness as well. So this being the second part, and the third and the concluding part in creating the scenarios, especially when we are creating our final choices, I would say that for some effect, we could definitely pepper our answers with some quotes, relevant quotes from Mahatma Gandhi or Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, or maybe Lord Acton. Now, in an example where we have, let's just say, corruption and misuse of power are very repeat case studies. Lord Acton had this famous phrase that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. Right. So small phrases like that kind of increase that impact of the answer and definitely are desirable in case studies as well.
Wonderful, sir. So now, sir, one of the important questions that I would like to address is that whenever we look at the questions, most of the students write similar type of answers, but yet we see there is a wide variety in terms of scores they get after they get the marks from the UPSC. So what is the reason of such a wide range of scores that we see in this paper when answers are more or less same as well?
That's such a nice question, sir. I would like to say, first of all, that one thing that one has to be pretty conscious about is a danger zone potentially is when we do not understand the depth of the question or what the question actually wants to ask us. So if we've understood the question, whether we know it or not is a further, complication from that point. However, whether we've been able to understand or comprehend the demand of the question is a completely different thing. And this becomes more troublesome, especially when the question seems generic or shallow. Now, I would like to say that those kind of questions tend to be generally more tricky. And thereby, in fact, if a question seems generic or tricky, one ideally should pay much more attention. Is it most likely me who's not being able to understand it? Now, starting from that point on, I would like to say that the answer quality obviously massively differs, which one can find very difficult to understand. So it can be difficult for a student to understand why I have had different marks. And particularly for the kind of justification one gives for usually the same kind of options that people tend to choose between the options provided for case studies. Now, we can see that through what we call the cognitive moral development theory provided by Lawrence Kohlberg. He gives us an understanding of how different qualities of ethical logics are of either a superior or inferior quality and thereby also parallelly fetch different kinds of marks. So, for example, that a justification which is based on the understanding of either reward or punishment simply. One saying that I would do this because it is legally correct and I shall be rewarded for it with maybe a promotion or maybe this is going to entail a punishment. That tends to be a pretty low quality of moral argument, similar to a kid with where one says to a kid that because you've eaten too much chocolates, you're going to get scolded, or because you've eaten dirt, or because you killed a fish from the aquarium or the pond, you're going to get scolded. And to the kid, the degree of the fright that is created by the scold is directly proportional to how bad the kid thinks the act actually is. On the other hand, if we look at an ethical logic which appreciates that law has to be followed because law and order is an essential prerequisite, and which is why I'm going to be following it, this is a more developed and nuanced logic. However, the best kind of logic is a principled stand. For example, that Mahatma Gandhi took principled stands and he knew at what time the salt law was to be broken because it was an unjustified law, and that sometimes ethics can be not only beyond law but at loggerheads with law. And when we give our justifications, which are principled justifications, that I support euthanasia because I believe that the right to life includes the right to dignified death. When we give that kind of logic to support usually the same kind of final answers, well, that kind of fetches very different marks based on the quality of logic that we have chosen.
So this is basically a secret to score more marks. You have to make a justification of things in terms of the requirement of the UPSC, of course, and that should be of higher order as well in that sense.
True.
Now, sir, one very interesting question which was posed to me by a student, and I'm taking forward to you in the same aspect. It has been seen that the themes of the topic that we see in the case studies repeat in terms of the basic essence. That does not change. So can we use the questions of the previous year in order to actually understand what should be the approach to solve these kind of questions, and getting the feedback from you or from some other expert as well, in that case, whatever is possible for our students, so that they can actually master this art of taking case study and scoring better marks.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, I would recommend to all my students, and I do, that one of the best things that they can do is go through all the previous year questions, and especially the case studies. Now, when we tend to, in fact, rely on a lot of books that are available in the market, the approach to those case studies mentioned there can often vary from what UPSC is saying. And we need to really get the knack of the approach of UPSC. And as such, the best way to ground our understanding, including understanding thematic repetitions and the approach of UPSC's case studies, is by going through all the previous year papers. We would definitely find when we do that, that a lot of themes such as women empowerment or sexual harassment or corruption, probity, insubordination, or land acquisition, tribal rights, environment, ecology, preservation are very many repeated themes year and year and year. Every year we see that. So the way that one benefits by looking at that is, once one identifies that these are repeat themes, first of all, one can take the simple steps of understanding the basic laws governing those areas, the basic procedures. One can be actively involved in making notes from current affairs and identifying what is happening, what is a new related area in relationship to these themes. And thereby one can absorb the specific terminologies, one can understand the procedures, and also through the practice, one can basically come down to a basic, standard, watered down set of the arguments. That if these be the dilemmas that are given to me, then this tends to be the answer. And once one is clarified in what is my order or line of thinking, then basically from that point on, this is not a lot of deviation, rather some on-spot innovation and creativity added to already developed themes and one's own approach on those themes.
I think that is very handy tool available to the students, through which they can actually master the art of attempting the case studies, defining the scenarios, defining the cases, and of course they can get expert guidance in terms of evaluation as well, which can help them to write better answers in the future as well. Sir, thank you very much for sharing all the wisdom. This is actually the part 2, so we have taken a lot of time from your side, of course, and you have been generous enough to share that time. We thank you from our side and also from the side of the students.
Thank you so much. Welcome, sir.
So now you must have understood how to handle case studies and how case studies can be approached from the perspective of the examination. This is part 2 of the video. You should watch this video in consonance with the part 1, and this will give you complete clarity about how to handle GS paper 4. I hope that you have learned enough, and this must have inspired some confidence in you as well about how you're going to approach the examination. So Rao's IAS keeps on bringing such kind of content, so you should actually keep yourself hooked into this entire ecosystem, and for that you should subscribe our channel, press the bell icon so that you are updated about the next release from our side. From the entire team of Rao's IAS, we thank you for your participation. Take very good care of yourself, and all the best for the coming examination. Take care.